Misericorde comes from Latin and means being merciful, compassionate. In Elden Ring, it actually signifies the pity you show your adversaries as you put them out of their misery after they fall off in combat. In today's video, we'll take a look at a really unique weapon that's rather easy to find, yet provides one of the biggest benefits for relatively little investment. This, ladies and gents, is the Misericorde, a super unique dagger that can work with a lot of different setups, which is why in today's video we'll take a look at all of them and how to actually make this weapon even more powerful than it actually is. Now, the Misericorde can be found quite early from inside a fog room when visiting the Stormveil castle. It's out there on some random corpse, and unless you knew any better, you'd be tempted to just forget about it in your stash. But there's one thing that makes it better than any other weapon for its intended purpose, and that is obviously critical hits. Because you see, this seemingly innocent weapon has the highest critical value of any weapon in the entirety of Elden Ring of 140. And that's not to say it deals 140% more critical damage. No, actually somewhere around 4 to 5 times more damage during backstabs or critical hits. As soon as you get your hands on it and use it, you'll immediately realize how devastating the damage is under the right circumstances. It even rivals some of the heavy or colossal endgame weapons that have to make up their lack of critical hits with more base damage. That being said, I wanted to see exactly which stat combination and which affinity provides Misericorde with the highest critical damage, which is why I've ran a bunch of tests. So the tests that you're about to see have been performed at roughly 75 into each attribute tested, with no damage talisman except the ones that provide stats such as the Radagon or Marika Sword Seal to reach those stat values in the first place. And then I've tested a bunch of enemies, in this case humans and dragons, since the game is pretty much filled with them. So the stat and affinity combos that I've tested are as follows. We've tested dexterity and keen, dexterity and lightning, strength plus heavy, intelligence plus magic and plus cold, and faith plus fire, flame art and secret, all respectively. Now, it might seem like a lot of numbers, and yes, it might get boring, but here are the lessons that we've learned from all of these tests. If your main focus is purely how much crit damage you deal with the dagger, you'll want, of course, a magical affinity or a status affinity and spec into the attribute that buffs that status damage the most. For example, if you're running a faith build, then obviously flame art affinity is the best since it further scales up that damage with your faith. If you're using something like dexterity, then lightning is the best since it further scales from high dexterity and you also get that bonus status damage from lightning on top. And if it's intelligence, then magic affinity is best, and so on. You pretty much get the picture. Basically, the more sources of extra damage you can provide to your weapon, and hopefully if they can also stack with your primary stat, then yeah, the more your critical hits will be affected to the point that you're going to deal insane amounts of damage. In the test that I was able to perform, the difference between the lowest performing affinity, usually non-magical, and the highest magical or status affinity was pretty much all the way up to 100%, so you could gain a double damage if you did everything properly. Another thing that we've learned is the fact that enemy weaknesses and resistances will heavily influence how much your crit does, which coincidentally is also the main reason why the Wrought Dragon received such a high damage when using flame art with the faith build, since it has very little resistance to fire. The same reason why lightning affinity deals such a high backstab damage to human enemies, because on their own are also very weak to lightning damage, and so on. Meanwhile, something like the cold affinity, which consistently came second last in most of the backstab or critical damage, doesn't give as much high extra damage, mostly because I believe it relies on the Frostbite buildup, which has its own damage once it pops, so I guess From Software did that for balancing reasons. With that in mind, I wouldn't immediately put these off yet, and there's a few build ideas and excellent combinations that I've run with Misericorde with high crit as well as not sacrificing too much into spell damage, so I'm kinda trying to make a build around all of these, of course starting with the one that we've covered in yesterday's video, which is the Ash of War Flame of Redmanes. Now this one requires a particularly closer attention because, as we've established yesterday, the Ash of War gets its highest damage bonus from strength instead of any other stat, even compared to Faith, which, at least in theory, since Faith should naturally buff up any fire damage, but it doesn't seem to be the case here. That being said, the strength test we did with the heavy affinity didn't produce the best results either, while the Faith one did, as we noted the benefit you get from the extra flame art affinity damage that also further scales with that Faith. But since we're not using any Faith here, obviously the flame art won't actually perform well and it's actually wasted. Fire affinity, on the other hand, will not, since this doesn't decrease the strength affinity, just the dexterity one, which leaves quite a nice room over there at a C rating to get some more benefit from the high strength value that you have. The result here is that you still retain the highest damage of the flame coming out of the Redmane skill, while still being not too far behind the critical damage of a pure Faith build, for example, under similar circumstances. So in this case, I'm still capable of dealing over 2000 damage with the Red Flame skill, while still being able to perform over 5000 critical hits on the same dragon, when previously I would have to sacrifice one of these two. Another really awesome combination is using either the Glint Blade Phalanx or the Glint Blade Pebble Ash of War variants, which have an extremely high stun capability, with of course the Phalanx being my favorite since it only requires about 2 casts of the skill to pretty much stun any boss in the game. Maybe a couple of exceptions, but even then 3 are more than enough to put it on its knees. In one of the runs that I've used, I knew I wanted to combine this with the strong effects of the Frostbite, but the problem was, as I've said, Frost Affinity consistently came the second last in all of the crit damage tests that we have done. Luckily enough though, the Frost Affinity does the opposite of the Fire one, which is to provide, or well, retain the C scaling into dexterity of the Misericorde, which means it's able to retain some of the pretty great crit damage, and of course you will want to run this with a high dexterity build to make the most out of it. In this case, it's not going to be as devastating as the variant with the Flame of Redmanes and Strength, but it's still getting pretty close, and most important, it gets a higher burst of damage if you couple it with the Frostbite at the same time. My preferred way of doing this was to make sure I hit the enemy once or twice before doing any critical hits, and then just making sure I cast enough of these Glint Blade Phalanx to put it on its knees. From here you would follow up with a crit from the front, which consists of 2 stabs, and coupled with the 2 stabs we did previously, this means almost a guarantee Frostbite. So usually this means I'm doing a critical and the Frostbite triggers during the critical, which results in extremely high burst damage that personally I just love. Now obviously there's other great items that you can couple with this, as well as abilities, the Flame Granny Strength being the best one for the Red Flames variant since it buffs both that fire damage and of course the critical hit you perform with the melee weapon. The Knife Talisman would also be a must-have in this situation since it gives you at least a 15% damage increase to your critical hits with the Misericorde, and from here it's all about preference. If you want to build around self-sustainability, you can use the 2 Assassin Dragon Talismans for mana and HP regen when performing crits, or if you want to rely more on the spell or skill damage, you can use the Shard of Alexander and either Fire or Magic Scorpion Charm to buff up either the Red Flames ability or, well, that Glintstone ability instead. Now on a final note, the only part that I haven't covered was the bleed/occult scaling. Reason being is because if you want any of these, you're not going to go for a dagger, when twin blades and even power stance rapiers are much better at applying those way faster, especially for the bleed parts. It's still an option that I'm still in the process of testing, and it's quite similar to the Lightning Affinity in the sense that if you still want to have that, the extra damage, and also get the stuns from the Redmanes or from the Glintstones, then you will want to have 2 separate weapons. One of them will have the affinity needed on, the Misericorde, and then you will want the permastuns on the secondary weapon and have that casted in the first place to follow up with the crits from Misericorde, but that's going to be a whole different topic in itself. In any case, let me know down below, are you running any similar setups with the same dagger, or are you doing something different? I would like to know your opinion, and I'll see you guys in the next video.